Thanks everyone for joining today. I'm Sanjay from OnHand. Thank you for joining the latest in our Impacts webinar series. Delighted to have some fantastic guests today. Today we're talking about refugees, really trying to shine a light on an issue that's controversial, I think misunderstood, and one that gets, I guess, a very bad name and press, really, from our mainstream media. I'd like to change some of that narrative, and I'm delighted to have two wonderful guests today to talk about that. The first is Dina Nayeri, someone who was born during the Iranian Revolution and had to leave the country, I think under threat of execution for some of her parents, lived as a refugee for 2 years before being granted asylum in the United States. She's an author of a multi-award-winning book, The Ungrateful Refugee, which the Observer described as a work of astonishing, insistent importance. Her essay of the same name was one of The Guardian's most widely read long reads in 2017 and has been taught in schools across Europe. She recently published her next book, Who Gets Believed, which explores the unspoken social codes that determine how we relate to one another and why people seeking asylum get dismissed as liars. In 2017 and 18, Dina travelled to Greece with Refugee Support Europe, making her first visit to a refugee camp since her childhood. That transformational experience inspired her writing in The Ungrateful Refugee and has led to her continued advocacy for the refugee support team and becoming a trustee. We're also joined by Rachel Ellis, the CEO of Refugee Support.
At all, no problem. Yeah, thanks so much for attending, everyone. It's really great to be here. So I am the Chief Exec at Refugee Support. I've been working in migration and with displaced communities for about 7 years now, out in the camps in Greece, and now also overseeing refugee support's work in Cyprus and in the UK, which I'm hoping we'll get a chance to talk about a bit more in detail. And I'm also, as Sanjay mentioned, pursuing a PhD in migration studies out of the University of Granada.
I'd love to come to you first. Has someone who's had lived experience of being a refugee, I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about your journey so far.
Sure. Well, I mean, it's been a long journey. So I start at the beginning. Like you said, I was born during the Iranian Revolution in 1979 and lived in Iran all through the war with Iraq. So I was there until I was 8 years old. And during that whole time, there was obviously this new regime that had come in and restricted the lives of women and minority religions and a lot of different people. It was a very difficult time in that sense. But at the same time, we were getting bombardments and, kind of reports from war, et cetera, a lot of death and danger. So during that time, when I was a young girl, my mother converted to Christianity. My mother and father were doctors, and they both had practices in Isfahan, and yeah, I think we lived a relatively kind of rooted life. And then when my mother became a Christian, she was very vocal about it. She was very passionate. She talked to her, about it with her patients and things, but she got into trouble really quick because, it's very dangerous in Iran to be a convert. It's not, it's not like being just a Christian from birth, which is more tolerated. If you convert from Islam, that's apostasy, and apostasy is punishable by death. So, my mother was part of this underground church and very active, Christian radio, secret Christian radio, all this stuff. And so she got in trouble very quick. She was arrested. All the details of this is in my book, so I won't go into too much detail, but at some point we had to escape the country, and we left with myself, my brother, my younger brother, and my mom. At that time, I was 8 years old. And so, we became refugees, and we were refugees for 16, 17 months, both in United Arab Emirates, where we were undocumented. And then later we were taken to a camp outside of Rome in Italy, in a little town called Mentana. And we waited there until we were granted asylum. So, that was quite a formative experience because it started when I was 8 and ended when I was 10, which, if you have 8-year-olds, what a formative time that is. And then I arrived, so we were sent to Oklahoma, which was also, as foreign to us as you can get inside America. I think perhaps it would have been a very different experience if we'd landed in New York or LA, where there's lots of other Iranians. But here we were the only Middle Eastern family in the community, and then thus began another challenge, I guess, as a newly arrived refugee in this American community and trying to assimilate or become a part of the place while keeping our identity, etc. So I won't go on too much longer, but that's the kind of skeleton of the journey up through my teenage years.
Thanks, Dina, and glad to report our tech issues are over. Hey, look, one of the things I really noticed when I'm looking at your history was you kind of bust that myth immediately on refugees leave because they're after a better life, and that's always the case. I'm sure that's the case for lots of people that have to move, but in your scenario, that really wasn't the case. Do you mind just taking 1 minute on that as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I see this with a lot of refugees that when they had to leave, they love their life. Their family is in their home. Their professional life is there. Everything that they know, their language, their culture, all that's familiar and safe until something happens to make it unsafe. And then you have to run, and you don't really think very much about what the next life will be. When you're running, you're just escaping for your life. And I think the very specific thing about refugees is that they have that danger. They can't go back. There's kind of a sudden break, and then it's all left behind forever. And that was definitely the case for us. We left with, a day's notice. I didn't have time to pack anything that I loved or say goodbye to my friends or my cousins or my grandmother. It was very clandestine, kind of in the back of the car and running to the airport. So yeah, I think there is a sense of great nostalgia and missing everything that was lost, but also missing everything that could have been. Because I think up until the moment of escape, you haven't prepared yourself for leaving. So you do have all your dreams that are still built, wrapped up in that home. All your expectations for yourself, everything like, short-term and long-term that you want to do. So there is kind of a jarring displacement there. And yeah.
Thanks for sharing that. I was quite struck by the way you described it when I was doing some background reading, and it sounded like, hey, really lovely life, dream life in the homelands, and then the way you described, I didn't move for a better life. I ended up in a destitute apartment for folks in Oklahoma. That wasn't the better life. It wasn't after a better life. So thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
If I can stick with you for one more question. And I know you visited some of the camps with Refugee Support. When you think about the main challenges that stand out to you for a refugee and that experience, what are they?
The main challenges for refugees, you mean?
Yes, please. Yes.
I mean, I think there is such a wide range. I mean, we focus so much on those immediate physical needs. You've left, you don't have much with you. You need, proper food, you need shelter, you need clothes, all the things that we do tend to focus on. I think there's, there's a next level of things that often get ignored. For example, for an ongoing education, for your mental health, so much. I think one of the biggest things that I found when I was visiting the camps that really resonated for me, that hasn't changed in the 30 years between, I guess, my two experiences in refugee camps, that hadn't changed, was this sense of, like, first of all, incredible shame and loss at no longer having your profession and the things that gave you all of your value and identity back home. And then this sense of, like, anxiety and dread because you are made to wait for such a long time. I think waiting is one of the biggest struggles that refugees have, because there's this great unknown. I mean, you don't know what country you'll end up in, but at the same time, I think the bigger question is, like, when will it be over? When will you know? When I talk to people in the refugee community, helpers and things, I think I heard some really poignant stories. But one guy, he was this wonderful man in Amsterdam who helped refugees. He said, what did he say? He said, if I ask you to wait for me for 5 hours, you will sit there and you won't sit there and wait. You'll go, you'll exercise, you'll read a book, you'll come back 5 hours later and we can chat. But if I tell you to wait for me for 5 minutes, and then again 5 minutes, and then again for 5 minutes, and make you wait for 5 hours. That's not the same. I will drive you mad in that 5 hours. And I think that that's the key thing for a lot of refugees, that they don't know when it will end. And it's absolutely maddening. It could be years and years, or it could be a few months. One refugee said to me, I was working on a piece for Refugee Tales, this wonderful anthology of refugee stories as told to professional writers. And he said to me, you know, I think prison is better, because in prison you count your days down, but when you are a refugee in detention or something, you count your days up. And that stayed with me for a really long time, because it's true, the waiting is absolutely maddening. And then the last thing I'll say is another big theme of this that I think people don't really spend time thinking about, because we're so concerned with those first order needs, is just the complete loss of like dignity and pride that comes with it. And that's why I was drawn to refugee support, because they focus so much on dignity. When I was a refugee, when we were in that camp, often clothes were donated and things were donated, and they were just tossed in the parking lot for us to kind of wade through. And my mother refused. You know, she's like, I'm not going to wade through people's old clothes. The charity was given to us in such an undignified way, in such an ugly way. And I think it wasn't bad intention. Nobody was thinking about, you know, issues of pride and shame and hurt and all that we carried inside us. They were just thinking about the clothes, and they were just thinking about the food. And I think there's a kindness in that. But I think some of the biggest struggles are psychological and mental health issues, and, you know, and the not knowing and the becoming lesser suddenly after, you know, your escape.
Yeah, the dignity point feels huge, and I've read about that before and spoken to Refugee Support and the work they do on dignity quite a bit, and that feels huge to me. I'm going to come back to the dignity point, Rachel. That's to ask you about the work you do specifically on dignity. But I wonder before that, could you describe a bit more about refugee supports and how you interact, I guess, at some of the front lines of refugee support in Europe?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I mean, there's so many different things that Dina obviously just picked up on there, which we can kind of go back to and explore in more detail. But I think really, exactly as Dina described, it's those kind of immediate needs, and also the kind of the tangible needs, the material goods, which is something that refugee support absolutely does. But the way we talk about it is that those things, what we do, what we distribute, what we offer, really is a means to something else, right? Which is this kind of space where people can form connections, where people can feel part of something, where people can begin to really build that kind of, or rebuild, we should say, right? Because it's not about building, because exactly as Dina said, it's not that people don't have dignity. It's not that people on the move, people seeking sanctuary, don't have dignity. It's that their dignity has been stripped from them, right? By the systems, by the waiting, by the context in which they find themselves. So we're really just trying to provide different spaces where people can reclaim that and start taking the next step. So what we do at Refugee Support, the way in which we try and do that is we have our projects, which we call dignity centres. So within the dignity centres, we have what we call a dignity market, which is essentially a free shop where people can really come and choose what they want. So we have either a points-based system, or we've even in the past, when it was set up in refugee camps, had money. We use monopoly money, so people can come and purchase. So the idea is that people choose what they want from the shops, and it might be it might be clothes, it might be food, it might be hygiene items, but really we are talking about those basic kind of physical needs. But again, that really is a kind of a means to something else, which is that there are these spaces where we are offering really an alternative welcome. So we're trying to, we're saying to people, we're saying to our members, we refer to everyone who comes to our door as a member. So we try and avoid kind of labeling, and this is something obviously which feeds massively into the narrative of kind of the negative narrative, Sanjay, that you were talking about before. But everyone who comes to see us is a member, so they're part of something, they're part of a club. They come and see us, they can shop in the market, but they can also access different services. They can take part in workshops, in activities, but more than that, they can just be, and they can have that kind of space to breathe and really just take a moment so that they can then take their next step. And that really ties into what Dina was saying, about the kind of the charity. We talk a little bit about kind of this shift really kind of from charity to solidarity. So what we're trying to do is really provide that space and facilitate people being able to take the next step themselves, rather than us directing it or us telling people what people need. So that's a little bit about kind of the context and how we operate. We've currently got 2 dignity centres. So we've got one out in Cyprus, in Nicosia, and another down in Bournemouth in the UK, which is our most recent operation.
Thanks, Rachel. And I guess one major background question for people attending who may have limited understanding of what causes this in the first place. Do you mind talking a bit about Syria, your Cyprus centre, and the type of people you see there and what they're fleeing from? Can you describe that a bit for us?
It is Cyprus.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. So Cyprus actually is it's in terms of the arrivals to Cyprus is massively underrepresented. So Cyprus receives the most asylum applications per capita in Europe, which is often forgotten. I think it's often lumped in with Greece erroneously, which means that kind of the contextual situation of Cyprus is totally left out and incredibly important. If you look at Cyprus geographically, it really is the kind of the gateway to 3 continents in terms of where it's situated in the world. So historically, there are a lot of arrivals that are coming from the global south, so from sub-Saharan Africa, who are arriving via Turkey and through northern Cyprus. But there are also a lot of arrivals coming from Syria, as you mentioned, Sanjay, who are already refugees in Lebanon, so many of whom have been based in Lebanon for a long time, who then come over to Cyprus from there. So it really is based on where it is, it really is a kind of a crucial arrival point, if you like, a crucial border from 2 different continents. And I think, because it is often forgotten, the level of support and the organisations that are operating there is very, very small. There really are very few organisations operating in that space, especially compared to somewhere like Greece, where there are a lot of different organisations and there's been a lot of focus also from the EU. So yeah, I would recommend everyone to go and check out the context in Cyprus, because it really is kind of the untold, really kind of the untold story at the moment.
And is it different for your centre in Bournemouth? Is it different? Do you see a different type of refugee arriving there, or what's the experience for them having arrived?
So there are commonalities across all of the dignity centres. So what we really realised, we've operated in multiple different locations. We also had an operation out in Moldova working with Ukrainians, and we've also had emergency interventions in places like Bangladesh and in Mexico, as well as operating in Greece, which is obviously where Dina came out and worked with us. So we worked in different places, and obviously the contextual challenges and the contextual differences always mean that there are, certain differences between the centres. But actually, exactly as Dina said, this really being stuck period, this kind of, creation of limbo between arrival and settlement is a commonality across everywhere that we've worked. And it really is kind of the people trapped in that space that we're trying to really trying to assist and that we're trying to support. So even though kind of the differences, there are differences actually in terms of what people need in that moment tends to be quite similar. So, obviously everyone has their own individual story and everyone has their own, often incredibly traumatic journeys, depending on where they're coming from. But in terms of what they need when they arrive, it's a human need. It's not a kind of, and I think this is something else that we talk about a lot of refugee support, is kind of this idea of kind of homogenizing people and kind of lumping everyone into the same group, and then we assume what they need. Actually, these needs are very human and they're very basic. Exactly as Dina said, there are the kind of the physical needs of the stuff that you need to rebuild a life, and then there's all the psychological and mental and emotional support and community support that you need.
Thanks, Rachel. And I'll ask you one last question around the centres. Obviously, Bournemouth, the UK, lots of race riots in the not too distant past over here. Did that affect your centres in Bournemouth?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the main thing that's been coming out from a lot of different organisations in the UK was that we were shocked but not surprised by some of the violence that we saw this summer. And I think really, the title of this session is about the narrative and about challenging the kind of the the negative narrative towards refugees and people seeking asylum. And I think the reason for this kind of lack of surprise is because they're in terms of this narrative, this overarching negative narrative towards people seeking sanctuary, it really has become a lot more mainstream, a lot more accepted in recent years. Not just in the UK, but across Europe and across various parts of the world. So I think this, in many ways, was a kind of a culmination in a lot of that, and was easily explainable by that. And yeah, absolutely, there was an impact. I mean, there obviously was the immediate kind of physical safety implications of that space, and we've operated, as I said, in multiple different countries, and actually out in Cyprus, we've seen similar violence in the last year. So we have contingency planning for those. For those kind of eventualities, unfortunately. But so there was the kind of the physical safety, but I think more broadly, it is about kind of how it ties into this like generalized narrative against people who are fleeing and who are looking for safety, and kind of what that does generally to us as a society and as a community that's that believes in human rights for everyone, right? And that's the thing, as I said before, we really are talking about basic humanity at this point. We're not talking about kind of anything specific. And I think I'm always very loath with a question about something that was so horrific as the racist and Islamophobic violence this summer, to find kind of some kind of silver lining, because I think sometimes we actually just need to sit with the discomfort of how awful something is in order to truly learn, rather than to try and desperately try and cling to something positive. But what I will say is that we have been broadly welcomed by Bournemouth and by the community there, and we've really received so much positive feedback from people there, and in terms of what the Dignity Centre there has done in terms of kind of community relations and assisting different people and bringing volunteers together, also in terms of how they can really make a difference. And so that's been really, really heartening to see. And in light of the violence specifically, we were contacted by perfect strangers via social media, via our website, to just basically say, not in our name, and by some people who didn't have kind of the means to give financially, or who even didn't want to kind of be part in the kind of the counter protests, because they were also fearful, but who basically wanted to show solidarity and show up and say, this is not who we are, this is not what we represent, and we're with you. And that's really the kind of the story of refugee support, is people just showing up and being part of the change they want to see.
Thanks, Rachel. I know we're coming up to the top of the hour soon, so please, if you do have questions, put them in the chat, and we'll use the 15 minutes after to go into Q&A. Dina, if I can come back to you, what are the most meaningful ways people can show solidarity with refugees, and how can we encourage everyday advocacy for displaced individuals, the antithesis to the negative press that we see like almost daily?
Yeah, I think often people tend to think that once refugees arrive, once people arrive in, say, the UK, that it's good. Their journey's over, they're safe now. So, like, we're done here. And I think there's a question actually in the chat, which I feel like I'm going to indirectly answer here, about, what are some of the most overlooked challenges for refugees after resettling? And I think that's a great question, because the journey doesn't end there. Once you're in the UK, you've arrived, you're a complete stranger. And, you don't have access to a lot of resources and language stuff, which is an immediate concern, which a lot of wonderful charities address. But I think the biggest challenge actually is to try to find your place in the community while holding on to who you are and your identity. And there's so many stages, to the settlement process. I think at first you feel tremendously just relief, grateful, you know that you'll get to build a full life here over the years. But very quickly that turns to a sense of, oh gosh, all the things that I no longer have. I don't have my profession. I don't have my identity. I feel a sense of shame. I feel a sense that, like maybe I'm not wanted here, especially with some of what, happens, I think, on the news, et cetera, in these countries where they arrive. So I think that the biggest thing that they need is actually much more one-on-one, much more personal, for neighbors and communities to reach out to them and be a part of their lives. But I think also it's important to step out of the context of giving charity. I think a lot of people are very good at, donating things, donating their time, kind of sitting in that perch of the charity giver, you know, joining language tables and offering things. But none of that is actually friendship, you know, and I think people stop right before that friendship phase. You know, and when you think about how you make a friend with someone who isn't a refugee, who has arrived from some other place to your neighborhood, I mean, what would you do? You go and you say hello, you find out what they're interested in, you find out what they do, you connect on the things that you have in common, and you know, you invite them to be a part of your life, your social life, on an equal footing. You know, there are charities that do friendship pairings with refugees that are not so much based on, you know, these broad demographic things as they are about like points of interest. Like, are you both interested in football? Okay, you two, you know, you can be friends and you can do something, you know, that is, I remember once I was I met up with a refugee who contacted me in London, you know, just to hang out. And I said, well, let's go walk through a museum. And the whole time I'm like, he's hating this. He's not an art person. You know, like, and I remember thinking like, actually, if he had someone that was more into sports, for example, that he would have a much more fun time. We had an awesome conversation about Iran, you know, but I think that the point was he needs a friend his own age, with his interests, you know, and, you know, and I think any sort of friendship can be magical. Like, if I had stayed in London, I think our friendship would have probably been based on our love of Iranian poetry and just that. But I think people need a range of relationships, just like you have in your communities, you know, and that's what leads to a fulfilling life. And I think it's really very, very hard to build that, you know, especially because these people don't reach out for that themselves because of a sense of shame, because of a sense of, well, you know, I'm not necessarily wanted here or something like that. And I think it's really important to reach out to them. And I do think sometimes people want to be very careful because they don't want to, let's say, you know, step on toes, re-traumatize people, you know, ask the wrong questions, be pushy, try to enter people's lives when they don't want their lives entered in. But I feel like I would say, at the risk of being wrong in some cases, I would say put aside those and kind of veer toward the little bit of pushy in a friendly, welcome way, because people do need each other. Everyone, even the most closed up person, needs someone to show up and say, hey, I haven't seen you in a while. How are you? Here's a bean salad. I don't know, like, you know, the things you do in your own community. And I think another thing is that, you know, newcomers often, whatever their circumstance, whether they're, you know, migrants or expats or refugees or whatever, they want to share who they are with you. And so it's really important to kind of dig in and ask what their life was like before, you know, not about the traumas and the things that happened, but like, what were you into? You know, like I think, you know, one of the things I found, especially walking around the refugee camps with refugee support, was how much people wanted to share and how generous they were with their stories and with their lives and with their passions. And I think being curious is one of the best things that we can do. Be curious the way you would be for anyone else. And I think that curiosity leads to friendship and love and community and all that stuff. As for advocacy, I think it's also really important, you know, to hear what those people need and advocate for those things. There is not enough educational opportunities in camps. They spend too long there without like their children having proper school. You know, often we don't allow people to work before they have a lot of paperwork. You know, I think people should be allowed to work the second they step into this new soil, because otherwise they will lose their fire, they will lose their skills and you know, their sense of purpose. So it's important to advocate for those things as well on local level, on a national level.
Thank you, Dina. That's a super answer. And there's many tips in there for what people can do on a daily basis. Rachel, what would you say to someone who wants to help refugees but may feel overwhelmed or unsure how to make a real difference? What small steps could individuals take today that would make a lasting impact?
Yeah, I think, and that point of overwhelm, Sanjay, I think is a really important one. And it's actually a conversation I also have with, you know, within my own network, is people feel kind of paralyzed by this kind of hopelessness and helplessness, right? And that's like a really vicious cycle to be stuck in as well. You know, we turn on the news, awful things are happening, we're constantly bombarded by awful things, and it just feels too much. And I always say to people, you know, that I never, because I think people also feel often a lot of guilt for not being more involved in certain causes that they, you know, feel really passionately about, but it's just too much. And I think that's the thing, is that we do live in a context where there is this kind of overwhelm, and, you know, constantly, you know, being bombarded with, you know, bad news stories doesn't help with that. So I think the first step I always say to people is, you know, try and, where possible, take a step back and work out what you really want to support with, and just really focus on that. And exactly as Dina said, where if that's kind of an individual personal connection, that's enough. Like, anything that you do is enough, and, you know, accept that. Don't try and change the world, because you know, you will end up actually being kind of more alienated from it. So, you know, our calls to action, our kind of CTAs are always the same. The first is about donating. You know, it's being totally transparent. It's incredibly expensive to stock the items in the shops that we run. We want everything to look good, exactly as Dina said. We don't kind of work on this model of, you know, donated items, of things kind of, you know, being well intended but actually not being good quality. We want people to feel you know, we want it to be a normal shopping experience above everything, and that costs money. So the first is about donating. The second is about volunteering, getting involved, and that doesn't just mean kind of going to the dignity centres. That can mean, I mean, everyone from, you know, Dina as a trustee, all the way through to kind of, you know, like our tech support guy for when I'm inevitably breaking things. You know, we are really volunteer powered, so there's always ways that you can get involved as a volunteer. And the third is about joining community, and really that is about kind of also about people finding their own space and finding their own way that they can support within the framework and the refugee support family that we've already built and that we nurture. And it's about, and that step really of joining the community really is about kind of overcoming the kind of this paralysis of helplessness. You know, that can look like all different things. It can be advocacy, it can be having a conversation around the dinner table with your family. You know, that can look like a whole host of things, and we've got loads of tools and resources and ideas of ways you can get involved.
Thanks, Rachel. And hey, I'm going to repeat it. So for anyone listening today, or if you watch the recording later, there's ability to donate, and I think we've shared a link in the chat there. If you're an OnHand customer on the app or platform, you'll see right at the top in the featured section, there'll be a donation button for refugee supports. I think Dina and Rachel have described what the work they do really, really well here. It's about being human, and it's about people who are fleeing countries having the ability to still feel human. So, hey, if you can, please do support financially. It's like all charities, there's a huge cost in running these things. Other ways you can support, there are via OnHand, there's mentoring for refugees, there's letter writing, and very, very basic ways to show some of that human kindness. So please do get involved, and I'm sure we'll have a number of refugee support volunteering roles on the platform too, so please look out for those. I'm sure you can see them on the Refugee Support website as well. All right, we'll move to Q&A. Kaz, I've seen one or two in the chat, but I'm guessing more have come through to you directly. Kaz, do you want to jump in and let us let's some questions?
Absolutely. So yeah, I've had a couple come through directly to me, and we've got around 10 minutes left. So if anyone else listening today has got any others, do try and ping them across, and I'll try and squeeze them in if we have time. First off, I've got one actually for both Dina and Rachel. How do you balance the urgency of humanitarian aid with the need for long-term advocacy and systematic change in refugee support? I don't know if Rachel or Dina.
I mean, how long have you got? Basically, I mean, if anyone's got the answer to that, I am all ears. Yeah, look, it's really tough. The thing is that in the end, that, you know, if you provide humanitarian aid, I mean, certainly our position is that there's no point providing aid without also trying to advocate for systemic change. Otherwise, what you're doing is essentially a plaster over a gaping wound. So so it is exactly as the person who asked the question, it's a fantastic question. It really is a balancing act between trying to immediately support the person that comes through the door on any given day, and at the same time pushing for real deep and meaningful change. And as Dina alluded to, kind of the right to work is something that we really push for example, in the UK. That's an example of a campaign that we feel really, really passionately about, and actually has overwhelming public support.
Yeah, and I would add to this that, there is an entire ecosystem of wonderful people doing, refugee support, and everyone has their own different role and skills. And I think part of what causes paralysis in people is thinking like, kind of the underlying assumption, I think, in that question is that you have to do both, or one person should balance both. And you really, really don't. You can be part of an ecosystem that includes lawyers and medical people and educators and writers. I mean, I often feel really helpless, when I see these amazing people at Refugee Support, like building things but I know that my special skill is words and stories. And as long as I can keep doing that and using my talent to like keep, the stories heard, that's my part in it. And another part I have is, I can translate to Farsi. I can talk to people in their home language. And that right there is enough for one person. And I think you yourself have something you can contribute that is a part of it. Is it more advocacy? Is it more like, hands-on help? I think that's for you to decide, but don't get paralysis because you think it's such a big bite to swallow all on your own.
That's wonderful, and I think certainly inspiring for lots of people on the call to hear that and hopefully take action afterwards. Dina, I've got another one here for you actually. So after your recent visits to refugee camps, do you feel the challenges faced by refugees have changed since your childhood, or are they very much the same?
I think some of them are the same and some have changed, like I was saying before, that waiting and the issues around dignity and shame are very much the same. And I think I connected with so many of the refugees, talking with them about our shared experiences in that way. Your sense of loss of self, loss of identity and culture, and of course your basic needs. But I think they have such bigger challenges now in terms of the hostility of the receiving countries. I remember like the American attitude toward us when we first arrived. I mean, there was a lot of racism, there was a lot of misunderstanding, but I think there was this general sense that America has a duty and a humanitarian duty. There was a much closer connection, I think, between the gatekeepers and like the refugee convention and their humanitarian duty and like what they're there to do. We are here to save people whose lives are in danger. And then, as a community, we are here to, help. And as much as there were challenges, I think that was the general attitude. And now the attitude is moving toward like, let's hunker down and protect what's ours and, and our birthrights and this and that. And they are other and outside and a threat to us. And I think that kind of attitude is it's hostile, but it's also painful to come into because you don't know who wants you there and who doesn't. And you get this general noise about how you are, hurting the country when you're really not, and so I think that is a huge challenge. It's a mental health challenge. It's a challenge in terms of getting past asylum officers and getting into the country. The asylum officers are changing their attitude in terms of what their job is. I think they're becoming much more like gatekeepers, and they see their role. I actually, for my last book, Who Gets Believed, I interviewed anonymously and a Home Office presenting officer, HOPO, as they call it in the Home Office, and that's like the Home Office's lawyer who makes the case against the refugees. And she said, my only job was to find inconsistencies in that story, and other caseworkers I've talked to also said, my job is to find inconsistencies. But 30, 40 years ago, if you had asked, an asylum officer what their job was, they would say, it's my humanitarian duty to find the people whose lives are in danger and let them in. I mean, it's the opposite. It's kind of like the photo negative, yes, you're supposed to find the right stories, but the assumption that they're all lies until proven otherwise versus they're all true unless you see something wrong with it. I mean, it's very different. I think it creates a different sort of atmosphere for refugees to walk into with their stories of like extreme pain and trauma. So I think it's tougher. It's much tougher in many ways. I should say, I want to say that one reason I was so drawn to refugee support was because they understood all this. And one of the most wonderful stories that I always remember is when I first went in, I was talking to Paul, who's the founder of Refugee Support. And, we were talking about all of these issues and the hostility, et cetera. And he said, as a result, I see that people don't ask for what they need. And my goal here is to create a shop that will make them forget they're refugees and will feel like their corner shop, so that, they don't think about, oh, am I asking too much? Is that person being hostile? They literally will just think of it as their own shop. And so, he said, my goal is to hear people complain about something. And so I think one of the is like, if someone complains, it's like it's their own shop. And so I remember when I went around and talked to the Iranians, very quickly, they had come to that attitude, like, well, tell him that the yogurt is not this way. Or I think the biggest complaint was fabulous. I said this to Paul, and he fixed it. I'm like, listen, basmati rice is not the same as Chinese rice. Okay, you need long grain for these people, and everyone was like way behind that request. I found it really, really funny, like the joy with which they received that request, but the ease and comfort with which the refugees were able to say that that's what they needed. And I think that that's the kind of environment that we want to create amid all of this hostility.
Amazing. Yeah, so insightful, Dina. And we've just got 1 minute left, so maybe this will be quite a quick one, but I'll try and squeeze it in. What kind of support is needed to help the mental health of refugees? Obviously quite a big question, but if anyone's got any, I guess, final answers for us, that'd be really great to end the session with.
I think for me, I mean, it's obviously we can talk about kind of like targeted mental health interventions, but that's not what we do at Refugee Support. And what we do much more is kind of talk much more around all of the other things that we've mentioned today on the call, right? Which is, and the what Dina brought up right at the top of the conversation about kind of spaces of belonging and spaces where people can rebuild their identity and purpose, and how people find themselves in a kind of new society and community. And really what we found is that these things, whilst they're things that we absolutely take for granted day in, day out, going to a shop, that normality, that sense of routine. Dina, you'll be happy to know we're still getting complaints, which I also see as a huge mark of success of people reclaiming their agency, right? I don't want these shoes because I don't like them. So great, that's brilliant, that's absolutely fantastic. But it's all of these kind of things that we take for granted in terms of choice. I mean, that have such an impact in terms of your day-to-day mental health, your well-being, and how you feel about yourself, and how you fit in terms of how you fit into the community. So I think, something that we really want to do, and what we're trying to do with the Dignity Centres, is show that this is an alternative right now, but we don't want it to be an alternative. We want this to be the norm, right? We want this kind of this way that people are received and welcomed to be the norm, and it can be, and it can come from from the community up. And I think with that in mind, not just people who are arriving will be much happier, but also that's also the community that I want to live in, right? So it's about being kind of part of the community, part of the change that you want to see.
Love those answers. Thanks so much for the time today, Rachel and Dina. What incredible insights you've given us. I'll try and wrap it up. Both of you mentioned actually Paul Hutchins, the founder of Refugee Support. Clearly, it's an amazing charity. I'm sure everyone that's listening today or listens to the recording will agree. Like outstanding work, just humanizing the issue, bring it to attention, but then the way you bring dignity back to people that are in that limbo is just quite phenomenal. For OnHand users, Paul's actually recorded another talk with us. This talk will be distributed to everyone that's attended today, so please do watch it back. Paul's recorded another talk with us about the origins of refugee supports. He mentions a couple of things that came up today, like the right to work. And again, very simple actions that you can take if you want to help. The right to work, the ability to create a corridor for refugees to come to countries like the UK, writing to your MP and ways to do that. That talk's on the OnHand platform as well. So please do that. Do look those up. I'll end today by just saying a quote that I looked up from Dina that really struck me as like the whole purpose of doing this session. And the quote is, "It is the obligation of every person born in a safer room to open the door when someone in danger knocks." Just like to leave you with that one. Thank you everyone for attending today. Thanks again, Rachel and Dina. An absolute privilege to have you on our talk today. Thanks everyone.
Thanks so much.